So, this week's text says bread so many times. We saw some bread dough, but this text is not really about bread, right? In the same way that the story in John of Jesus at the well with the Samaritan woman is about water, but it's also not really about water. So this text is not to discount that God, in the presence of Jesus, doesn't not care. Too many negatives. It's not that Jesus doesn't care for the physical needs of the people. And Jesus is trying to point them to understand it is beyond the physical needs that they're experiencing. Jesus in John 6 is trying to remind the people that bread given as he fed the 5,000 was not just about bread to fill their stomachs. And so Jesus in John 6 is doing something interesting, even though they keep going back and forth about this bread. Jesus is trying to get them to see the spirit behind the bread of the miracle that they experienced in the wilderness. Jesus says at the beginning of this text, "I assure you, you sought after me not because you saw miracles done, but because you ate and you were full." Because at our most simple, we are driven by our physical needs. And he's not shaming them for that. He's not like, "Oh, you stupid, hungry people." He understands that physical need, and also Jesus is maybe a little bit sad that they didn't see the deeper underlying information conveyed through the miracles. Or that they're so forgetful of the miracles because they're so focused on their physical needs. So in some ways, Jesus is not trying to shame them like, "Oh, you stupid, hungry people." But Jesus is saddened, "Oh, wait, right. You are physical body needing hungry people, and that stops you from seeing the deeper context, the deeper meaning." And so Jesus then is like, "I have to spell it out a little bit clearer." So let's first understand Jesus is not chastising the people for having physical needs. Sometimes people read into this text that Jesus is chastising those physical needs because you don't understand Jesus' spiritual presence in your heart. That's not what Jesus is doing. Jesus, though, is inviting us to look past just the bread. Yes, it's about bread, and it's like a little bit of, has anyone here ever done a little bit of, joined a improv troupe before? Or done an improv game? It's like the yes and. So Jesus isn't saying, "No, not your physical needs, ignore your body, it's about the spirit." Jesus is saying, yes, and there's something deeper. So what is the deeper thing Jesus is pointing people towards when he says, "Surely you didn't seek me out because you saw great miracles, but because you ate and were full"? Well, in the narrative of John up until this point, Jesus has fed the 5,000, so made food where there was almost none, and Jesus has also walked on water. And the people say to Jesus, they had looked in Tiberias, they'd looked into the boat and they saw Jesus wasn't there even after he had walked on water. And then in Capernaum, they say, "Jesus, basically, how did you get here?" And Jesus is like, "Oh yes, you've forgotten. I don't need a boat." But you're wondering that because you are forgetful. Or you're not taking the seriousness, maybe, or the continuity of that miracle. And then they've forgotten that Jesus fed people when there was no way to be seen. Not just because he could. Jesus fed people out of nothing. The spirit of that miracle is you need a miracle because there is no other option. Not just like Jesus is your walking bread machine. And so what Jesus is trying to get the people to understand is that there is context in which God performed that miracle. Because God is about bringing abundance when there is nothing. That God is meeting the physical needs of people in moments when they would otherwise have nothing. That God is sustaining life in that moment, not to be a walking gumball machine of a prayer answerer. And so Jesus in John 6 is sort of trying to say, wait, hold up, let's go back. That miracle of the 5,000 loaves and fishes was not me being your gumball machine. You can't just put a quarter in me and wind me up and get bread. It is deeper than the physical bread I have given you. That's not what faith is. It's not just to use me like your gumball machine. Has anyone in here experienced in their world or around them, or maybe even in your own faith life, moments when God just felt like maybe a bread machine? Like, I need something specific, and I'm just going to have faith until that specific thing is given to me. Or when that specific thing isn't given to me, it's difficult to sustain the faith. And again, Jesus isn't shaming you for having those moments. Because there are those moments in which that's real. In moments of lacking complete employment, and you're like, I just need this job. God, if you just give me this job, I'll be a lifelong Christian. I'll just sing your praises, and I'll be the most faithful person in the world. Just give me this job. There are moments when that is so needed. And God does meet people in those places. But the spirit of the 5,000 loaves and fishes is that God might be sustaining you and meeting you in surprising and unfathomable ways that aren't just about, so I've gotten you jobs in the past and I'll get you another job. Right? God's not a vending machine. And I think that's what Jesus is trying to explain to the people. I'm not your bread vending machine. I'm something deeper. I am something that is abundance and that is life, that is forever, that is eternal, that you cannot fathom. Right? So as I was doing sermon preparation for this, I did what is probably the most unorthodox sermon preparation you might think of. I was having trouble figuring out, like, what is Jesus saying about faith in John 6? And so I went to Valley Fair. I was struggling to kind of shake up my brain and not just talk about, like, bread and God will sustain you and your needs. Because there's so many sermons that are just like, God will sustain you and God will just keep loving you. I was like, I need my brain to get shaken up. And I need to understand a little bit deeper what Jesus is talking about as Jesus points people towards an idea of what faith is. So I was like, all right, I'm going to go by myself. I'm going to spend the day at Valley Fair. I like roller coasters, so maybe it's also that. But I got on Wild Thing. Has anyone been to Valley Fair and ridden the Wild Thing? That big green coaster, it reaches I think top speed of 65 or something miles per hour, and it starts 207 feet up in the air. And let me tell you, everybody believes in God on a roller coaster, right? Everybody believes in God on a 207-foot roller coaster. Everybody believes in God during turbulence on a plane. Everybody believes, right? Those moments where it doesn't matter what faith you are, everybody in there is praying. And I'm riding this roller coaster, and this is the first time I ever sat in the very front row. And if you know a roller coaster, the very front row is like the scariest place to be, because as you come over that hill on that first car, you are the person, and I was alone. There's nobody with me to like be in solidarity and scream like look at each other like we're about to die, right? Everybody else behind me is in groups, and I'm just like alone staring down this hill. And you hang over the edge for a second, and you think, wow, these engineers better have really done their jobs. And I'm about halfway through this roller coaster, zooming around one of the banks, and it hit me. I was like, oh, that's what Jesus is talking about. But it's not that Jesus is talking about the roller coaster, right? Because people always read so many articles like, faith is a roller coaster because there's all these dips and turns, and God's with you along the way. I'm not saying that Jesus was my riding partner. That's not what I'm saying. Because a lot of people will write little nice Christian articles telling you, Jesus is your riding partner on the roller coaster of life. Which is like not often super helpful. What I mean when I say that I had this epiphany on this roller coaster as I'm screaming around this bank at 65 miles an hour is that so many people are ready to pray on that roller coaster and have faith to get them to the end of the roller coaster because they have this physical, immediate fear. But once that roller coaster coasts into the exit and you are able to get out and get off, everybody forgets about that. It's not a sustaining faith to pray and believe in God while you're screaming around the roller coaster at 65 miles an hour, dipping and turning. And then when you get off the roller coaster, you forget your physical need and your physical fear. And also, there was actually a logical likelihood that you would survive the roller coaster. If you already know logically that something is possible and will happen, the faith doesn't really mean anything. It's just sort of an extra bump. Does that make sense? Soren Kierkegaard talked about faith. If you've ever read Fear and Trembling, maybe you know this, but there's this book called Fear and Trembling that the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote. And he wrote on faith and what a leap of faith is. And he talks about how faith is not to have something that is rational and likely and then bring God into that. Like if I'm like praying that for dinner, I'm going to get to go out to dinner and blah, 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 and I'm going to have a great time. That's like, I can make that happen. That's like rational. It's in the realm of what will happen in my life. If I'm on a roller coaster praying to get to the end of it, it's not because I don't trust that this lap bar is actually, like they've done, all of the people who work at Valley Fair have done like 1,000 different things to make sure that I'm going to make it to the end of that roller coaster. That is rational, scientific, and likely that I will make it to the end of the roller coaster. And if I don't survive the roller coaster, nobody is likely to blame that on God. They're likely to blame that and sue Valley Fair. Because it's not faith necessarily to make it to the end of a roller coaster and say, wow, Jesus did an amazing job of keeping my lap bar down. It was rational and likely that I would survive to the end of that. It's not God making something out of nothing. And so I use that illustration to explain, right, that in Jesus telling the people, no, I'm not just going to give you more bread right now, is sort of one of those moments where Jesus is saying, the moments in which I serve you bread are contextual. It's not just all the time, always, forever, bread just coming out of me. Because in the desert, there was no rational way you could have assumed I could feed you. Right? You had faith to stay and to be present with the community in faith that there would be a way made. God giving manna to people in the desert was about there being a nothing and having faith that God would provide in that moment. Moses didn't go and bake thousands of loaves of bread to give to the people. It was about God making abundance where there was none. And so now that the people are just following Jesus around, city to city to city, like Jesus is like, you could just go buy bread. We're in a city. There is food for you somewhere that does not require something out of nothing. This is not a faith moment. This is you hounding me down, stalking me through the Holy Land in hopes that I have more bread for you. because you are seeking after me not for your faith, not for a spiritual sense of presence, but because you want more bread. And so Jesus is spelling out for them, I am more than a bread machine. I am the bread of life in the sense that I am a source of something completely unfathomable. In your biggest moments of despair and of nothingness, I am still abundance. I am life. I am liberation where there is captivity. I am freedom where there is oppression. I am love where otherwise your world has created hate. He's trying to get them to understand it goes beyond the bread they're eating with their mouths. The gospel is not, the good news is that Jesus Christ came to make bread and give it to everybody. That's not what the gospel is. The spirit of Jesus coming to feed the 5,000 and then talking about this in John 6 is that is a symbol for all of the things in our world which we cannot fathom being true, coming through Jesus' ministry and Jesus' example and God's reconciliation of all the people through Jesus. And note that Jesus says, and this is not your work, because the people keep saying like, okay, cool, so like what do we do though? So like if you're not going to give us bread though, then like, but what should we do? And Jesus is like, nothing. The work is not yours. The work was not Moses's. This is God's work on earth in the world. When I was growing up, I didn't understand I didn't like sacraments. I didn't understand them, and especially baptism. There's a lot of arguments, right? Like baptism is weird. Like why are we as people like holding this child and then just putting water on them and then, or why like as adults you're kind of coercing people into feeling like they have to go through this sacrament, otherwise they're going to burn in hell. And so I always cringed, especially at baptism, until I was in seminary. And I read Martin Luther's defense of infant baptism. And he talks about how baptism is not a human work to a human work, forcing that person to be the same faith as that person. Baptism is a place in which God meets us and reminds us of the promises that have already been made before us. That we get to be part of that promise. It is a proclamation that we are part of that promise. And it's not a human deciding anything. It's humans bringing another human into a human context in which other humans get to hear the truth of that promise, sure. But babies are the best example of the fact that there is nothing you can do to earn or deserve or work harder towards being loved. You already are, simply by the nature of being born. Babies can't do anything, right? Like they can't lift their heads. They can't feed themselves. They can't walk. They can't work. They can't toil. They can't labor. And so what I was compelled by in Martin's writing was that babies are the best physical example of the fact that a faith life is not for us to be constantly working and toiling to get more bread out of Jesus. It is to live into the promises and the love that has already been, so that we can participate in what is not yet. What is not fathomable to us, but that we can participate towards regardless. Like true peace, true liberation is not fathomable to me. I cannot imagine a world in which terrible people aren't constantly fighting, and there aren't bombs being dropped, and people aren't being excluded from communities. I can't fathom that. And yet, the gospel's hope is to give me an imagination empowered by what Jesus is talking about so that I can participate in something more abundant and deeper than just like, I want what's mine. I want more bread. I want to feel more loved. Right? So I think what Jesus is trying to invite us into here is to imagine something beyond the bread. So in your life, in your community, in this whole church, there are things we cannot fathom that are not existing in our reality now, that we deeply need, that aren't just about getting something out of a vending machine, and also we can't work for or toil for. So what is Jesus speaking to you today that is beyond the bread? What is Jesus, for you, opening you up to that's like, yes, sure, bread, yeah, you need to eat, and also, ... What is John 6 trying to crack open your imagination to? Faith can feel harder when it's completely intangible. It feels easier when you imagine Jesus as your riding partner and your lap bar and your bread. It's harder when you imagine that Jesus is something that you have not yet even begun to imagine. But that's what Jesus, I think, is trying to encourage us to do. Have a little bit of a deeper imagination. So this week, just invite you to chew on that. Clearly easy, am I right? Just a little simple task. Amen.